Next up, we have Yorke Rhodes III with Microsoft. Yorke is a passionate technologist who earned his degree in computer science from NYU. He has over 20 years of experience in software across large companies that include Microsoft and IBM, as well as with startups in wireless, mobile, digital marketing, and e-commerce. After ignoring Bitcoin for many years, his interest was piqued by blockchain in the summer of 2015 when Ethereum was launched. Today, Yorke works on partner and corporate strategy around blockchain at Microsoft and is also an adjunct professor at NYU in the Masters of Integrated Marketing and Leadership programs, where he is currently developing a course on the user-centric economy called #OurNextEconomy. Actually missing Yorke Rhodes. Ah, there you are, thank you. Welcome to Yorke. Are you going to use that presentation? Or?
No, I'm going to use this.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. It's great to be at Rice University with so many friends. As you can see, I'm a believer, or I wouldn't be here. And I'm hoping to speak to new friends today. So I'm going to try to translate the new nouns and verbs that you're hearing all morning into actionable tasks and why this is so relevant. Actually, it took me, by the way, a computer science degree, doing many years of business, about 6 months of study, actually, to learn this new programming paradigm and concepts. Joe Lubin was actually sort of my mentor and the first person that I met in the space. And when I realized I was going to be meeting with him, I had to keep studying. So, and I walked into Joe's office, I think it was January 9th last year, after my 6 months of study, and after just sort of discovering this on my own in the summer. The price of Ether was 94 cents. So, and some of Joe's employees were encouraging me to purchase this funky thing called a crypto token, and of course, I'm a pretty conservative investor, so I didn't take their advice, unfortunately. But at $48, I think it's still a good buy. So, and if anyone was checking the price of gold versus Bitcoin, Bitcoin is past the price of gold. So we're in an interesting time. So I mentioned nouns and verbs. And I'm also going to skip around my presentation to try to limit it to the time of the talk. You can come up with distributed acrylic graphs, smart contracts, Solidity, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, you name it. There's a new verb and a new noun for it. So it literally is a new programming language. It is a new business context. And so we have to sort of figure out how do we onboard ourselves and our companies into this new business context. The opportunity is substantial, as you've heard this morning. And there are a couple of sort of nuances that I'm also going to speak about briefly, based on some of the commentary about databases and things like that as well. So I'm going to take you very quickly through a section that I call "The World is Filled with Inefficiencies." And so it's going to actually be hard for you to keep up, but just know that we're talking about inefficiencies. So settling a share of stock, obviously 3 days. Validation of identity from a KYC or a banking perspective to avoid things like anti-money laundering, 12 days. If you're going to go work for Goldman Sachs as an employee, for example, or any other company, I'm sure BHP Billiton is the same, it's probably 37 days or so to actually get onboarded from a background check perspective. Microsoft itself has thousands of bank accounts around the world, so we are a multinational, interesting company with lots of different legal entities. And I'll come back to this a little bit later in terms of how is blockchain in a private context relevant inside of a company. It's certainly relevant in a multinational conglomerate. 1,600 people are employed to deal with reconciliation. So reconciliation is not just a banking problem. Reconciliation is a database problem that we've been dealing with since I started working with databases back in the early 80s. So, sorry, dating myself. So every industry has issues with fraud. It doesn't matter whether it's advertising, banking, crypto tokens, et cetera. And the cost actually, specifically in advertising, and I have a partner that I work with in this particular space, very specifically looking at addressing how do we deal with the multi-layered network that is advertising. Particularly, how do we deal with things like bots that run and actually allow people to achieve revenue that's not actually associated with ads that people are looking at. Tax return fraud in the US is a $21 billion problem. If you look at a single interesting scandal, it was a $65 billion problem. If you look at humanity and the area of provenance of food, this is a pretty big area. The 2008 Chinese milk scandal actually had 300,000 victims. Anywhere where we have systemic food supply issues, we also need to improve how we're actually tracking that food supply. So suffice it to say that there are billions of dollars of opportunities, and again, it's across many different sectors, including government, business, and humanitarian sectors as well, and we're working across all of those. So blockchain can help, and so far we've really talked about how do we actually eliminate costs, and this is where most people will start. Most enterprises will not start with trying to figure out what's their new business model. They'll try to figure out how do we actually improve the back office, and how do we actually reduce costs or fraud or some other systemic problem in our business. It can obviously unleash new business models. Consensus Studio, as an example, is a company that is very focused on creating new ventures that actually disrupt existing business models. So as an example, in KYC, which is stands for Know Your Customer in the financial sector, Know Your Customer is important not just in the financial sector, but across sectors, and will become more and more important if we think about the future where we have blockchain-based tokens. Anytime you're exchanging value, KYC is going to be a problem. In trade finance, this is a multi-billion-dollar opportunity, particularly interesting because trade finance is essentially the financing of trade or supply chain. Supply chain, typically in any industry, whether it's apparel, oil and gas, steel, computers, represents a very complex multi-party, multi-legal entity distribution of wealth, essentially. Often it's called a value chain. So you have many parties that you work with in that value chain, and you need to establish some kind of trust-based relationship in that value chain. In global B2b payments, we have a number of organizations that are actually working in that category in the market, who are trying to disrupt things like SWIFT, as an example. And a company at sort of the scale of Microsoft, when we're transitioning money from one bank account to another, how do we do it? We typically use something like SWIFT. And for those of you who know SWIFT, you know the time delay that takes and the cost associated with that. And it's quite frankly crazy that Microsoft, who's holding money in one bank account and wants to move that money to another bank account, has to go through an external party to actually do that. So how do we actually look at some of these problems? The root cause of the problem is actually trust. And we heard terms this morning like trustful, trustless, veridical, which is Joe's favorite word, I think. Trust between counterparties is actually one of the business value propositions associated with this technology, both in the public deployments as well as in private deployments or permission deployments. The other big problem that we see in the world, especially if you're a database-oriented person, is duplication of data. If you are anywhere close to startups or the CRM, customer relationship management scene, there was a time period of about 10 years, probably more than 10 years ago, which was focused on one customer record, one customer record initiatives were very specifically dealing with duplication of data. And duplication of data means that you have to do reconciliation, another favorite term of this industry. So if you look at sort of an example of multiple corporations and whether this is a financial transaction or not, each corporation is their own siloed entity with their own permission context. So you log into your networks at your company, no one else can log into your network at your company, right? So that gives you a permission on your network, a permission to do things like update transactions in a database. Every company has that, and there's no trust between those companies. So what happens is when you want to do a multi-party transaction, whether it's financial or tracking supply chain, we introduce yet another database. And so starts the reconciliation problem. So in order to deal with reconciliation of databases, we introduce a third database, right? That's a smart thing to do. But this is what's happening across every single industry in the world. And this is why there's so much time and energy actually spent on reconciliation. So the challenges with this are essentially you've got slow processing. Everyone, as I mentioned, has their own database. Reconciliation implies dealing with errors, right? So there's always a high risk of errors. Security between legal entities is important. And then obviously from a compliance perspective, there's a big overhead as well. So when we move to a world in which we can actually establish some kind of technical trust and security trust between entities, we actually move to the point where we can get to something which we would like to call a single version of truth. And if you go back to the CRM example, it was essentially a one customer record, something that was a problem within a single large entity. When you do that, then you can start to actually move from some of the issues today around reconciliation into a world where certainly all of the startups in this space are focused, which is get rid of the intermediaries. And that's called disruption. And so that is the world of the startups in this space who are focused very hard on disruption. Obviously, that is very important because it drives the behavior of enterprises in the space. And most enterprises, for example, in the financial services industry, have been dealing with the disruptive power of Bitcoin since 2009. And hence, most organizations in the financial industry have actually spent a lot of time looking at how can blockchain actually benefit my business, how might blockchain disrupt my business. So if you look at this particular scenarios chart, you can see that the financial column is actually the largest because it's been the largest discovery of opportunities within that particular sector. What I would tell you is that you might not see your specific industry or use case on this particular chart, but have a 5-minute conversation with anyone in the space and you'll discover opportunities. One of the best examples that I've seen of a business that actually was able to actually get people over the hump from a business perspective very quickly is a client of ours called BNP Paribas, which is a French bank. They actually ran a 2-day hackathon. They called it a Biz Hackathon. And in that hackathon, they brought in people from the business, and they had sort of 5 different areas of discovery that they were going to focus on. It was sponsored by the COO and the CIO of the company. There was a prize, like most hackathons, there were prizes. And people were basically designed to go off, learn a little bit in the morning, have some facilitated workshops with experts from the blockchain industry, and then come out the end of the 2 days with a presentation to the COO to get their projects approved. My most interesting sort of insight from that was I was sitting at the table after one of the working groups during lunch, and a woman from the legal department had a huge look of skepticism on her face that there was going to be any value that possibly could come out of this. And what was amazing to me was when we got to the final presentations to the COO and the CIO, she was the most ardent, vocal presenter on that particular team in terms of why this has to be done right now and how there's value in this. So it was a really interesting 2-day sort of transition for people in the business, and there was no code touched during the entire 2 days. It was literally a business conference, very specifically for the company, focused on how do we actually take internal use cases and start to understand. So this is your typical cartoon, which is, you want a blockchain, what color? Okay, now I'm going to start skipping through slides pretty quickly here. What I'll tell you is you can't buy a blockchain. You can implement a blockchain that has qualities, but more importantly, there's a lot of stuff around blockchain, around business process that's really important. So in 4 words, if you were to say what is blockchain, you could basically say that it is a shared, distributed, secure ledger. There's a whole bunch of technology and nouns and verbs underneath that that actually gets you there. But if somebody asks you in 4 words what it is, those are the 4 words you should use. It uses a distributed ledger of transactions. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think we already have. Importantly, if you look at traditional systems that are centralized, everybody is writing to a single central database. Joe talked about the problem with identity. It's well established that identity systems, whether it's Amex, the federal government, Target, Home Depot, I could go on, are honeypots of identity and personal information that can be hacked. And moving that to a distributed environment was actually quite valuable. So in blockchain, we basically have this distributed system and a distributed ledger. One point I want to make on this slide is many people call it a database because it's easy to think of it that way. Someone earlier talked, or actually a couple of speakers earlier talked about sort of the Google, or the new Google. That's actually a very interesting context because what we associate with Google is searches and searches of metadata and links off to other data, right? So blockchain effectively is not a place where you store your big data. Blockchain is a place where you store metadata and hashed references to off-chain data. And off-chain data in and of itself could, particularly in an enterprise context, have its own permissioning model associated with your enterprise. So there's really some nuances here that we have to be careful of. While blockchain will probably disrupt every technology in some way, including databases, it is not in and of itself a database like a stream database. It is not allowing you to do stream analytics very well. It is not relational in the way that SQL Server is meant to be used for massive amounts of wide records with lots of volume of records. That's not a blockchain. A blockchain I like to think of as an index. So it's very similar to an index in a lot of ways. So I know Sandra Rowe from CME Group is going to talk later about tokenization of assets, but particularly in the commodities space. Tracking physical assets or people, for example, and we talked about identity, is actually a really interesting opportunity. The technology within blockchain allows you to do that. And what we will probably see is a number of hybrid scenarios between public and private blockchains around tracking assets. We're seeing that in supply chain as an example. So I'm not going to talk too much about smart contracts. The way you want to think about smart contracts, though, going back to the database analogy, is when we started with relational databases, we had no server-side processing capability, so someone introduced this idea of stored procedures. Stored procedures became very misused and much maligned, but effectively a stored procedure is very similar to, or a smart contract in its concept is somewhat similar to how you might think about a stored procedure operating on triggered data, triggered events from data changes within a database. Okay, so Microsoft's perspective generally in the world is that developers are important and vibrant ecosystems are important. So if you look at what we've been doing for the last couple of years in terms of blockchain, we've been helping to develop the ecosystem and help making the products in the ecosystem accessible to our enterprise customers. So we have a big focus on developers, enabling developer enablement tools. We actually launched last spring Solidity extensions into Visual Studio so that the 9 million Visual Studio developers could actually take advantage of smart contract programming language on Ethereum. These actually are a number of projects that are capable of running today in Microsoft's cloud infrastructure. This is a very easy way for us to help our clients get up and running on blockchain and testing out various flavors in a test environment and then moving those into production. A couple of other things here. We've talked about public ledgers and private or consortium ledgers. Public ledgers we would consider Ethereum, Bitcoin, and any number of other ledgers that might have special purposes. And then on the right-hand side here, we have the private and consortium ledgers. Consortium is a term that's been used a lot in the last year. I like to call it value chain. So in a supply chain context, you would have a consortium of people in your value chain. The private and consortium ledgers are most typically permissioned enterprise ledgers. So how do you actually operate in a private environment across enterprises and establish trust using this technology? Cloud is a very good vehicle for that. It makes it quite easy to do that. And we've actually stood up capabilities within Microsoft's cloud that allows you to very easily create and join consortium networks, whether you're in the same enterprise, whether you're in the same enterprise with multiple legal entities, or whether you're in completely different enterprises that might exist in a value chain. A couple more points. I'm not going to talk about consensus algorithms. Okay. So Microsoft launched something we call Bletchley. It's just a sort of a code name, stands for Bletchley Park for anyone who's into cryptography. If you look at this particular picture, this sort of represents our ecosystem view of the world. And you can assume that this either runs on-site or in Microsoft Cloud environment. Importantly, we're doing most of our work in open source. So whether it runs on our cloud or someone else's cloud or on premises, that's just as good for us. What we've sought to do at the bottom layer of this particular stack is to enable choice among our customers and enable sort of the Darwinian approach of, the most successful wins. It's too early to pick bets. We, as an ecosystem player, would not likely ever pick bets, right? In fact, if you look at our cloud today, we have competitors running on our cloud like Oracle Database and SAP and other companies like that. And you can see SAP is actually represented on the screen here. In the middleware, and this is where really we're spending our time, is in enterprise glue that allows you to take the interesting trust context of blockchain and connect it into your permissioned enterprise systems, and to do it in a way that is scalable and secure. And that's not easy. So we are investing most of our engineering resources there so that this happens in a very secure and scalable way that's accessible worldwide to our enterprise customers so that they can more easily take advantage of the value proposition associated with blockchain ledgers. If you move up the stack, you can see that we have obviously focus across a number of industries. You will see Microsoft first-party applications that take advantage of the qualities of blockchain. LinkedIn is a great example in the attestation and identity space of where we're doing some work to get to validated company attestations, right? LinkedIn today is completely self-attested, right? We put up there as a consumer what our work history was. It'd be nice if we could actually have a built-in verification, and so that you could actually have, I worked at Microsoft from 92 to 2000, and that's been verified in some way. And then there's other stuff in the middle layer here too. I mentioned earlier the complexity of systems that exist today in enterprise and how you might build those, and I'm going to actually touch on that now. So there's pre-ledger, ledger, and post-ledger in terms of data patterns. If you look at IoT or supply chain or RFID or apparel tracking, There's a ton of big data coming off of those sensor devices, like the IoT devices. And that data has to be made sense of and ingested, usually transformed into something so that you can make sense of it. And the data in and of itself, before it ever touches a blockchain, needs to make sense to the players in the industry. So for example, if you have retailers and brands exchanging data so that they can have better visibility in the supply chain, they have to agree on the data formats. Right? And there are in apparel in particular standards where you can actually have that agreement, and as long as you are complying with the data format standards in a particular industry, then you'll be able to actually make sense of the data that your partner is sharing with you. There's also something called oracles, and an oracle in the blockchain context is somebody who has a verifiable data source of value. So you might think of a stock price, or someone who provides stock prices as an oracle. That's interestingly not done well in the blockchain space because it breaks the security context and the trust model of blockchain. So this is one of the areas that we're also focusing on quite hard with a technology we call cryptlets, which will allow you to actually have verified oracles from third parties. And you can imagine a company like Thomson Reuters, for example, it would be a great oracle for blockchain. Let me jump quickly for, okay, so I want to take you through a quick dive of what a solution around blockchain looks like. If you start at the 100,000-foot view, you have the ledger-focused data and development in the middle. You've got a whole bunch of pre-ledger workflow in your enterprise systems, and then you've got a whole bunch of post-ledger workflow in your enterprise systems, like things for visualization, things like that. If you move down to the 10,000-foot view, you can start to see, well, what are those things that we're doing pre-ledger and post-ledger? This is where you talk about all the processing and storage and things like that that I talked about earlier. And this is going to be very hard to read, but at a 100-foot view, this is actually a representation of lots of different enterprise systems that will come into play, and you can see the thin layer in the middle. It's called a ledger. So in an enterprise context, there is a ton of stuff that's happening off ledger. And this is where your legacy world exists today. If you expect to gain value in an enterprise from ledgers, you have to be able to connect to it. And I'll wrap up there so I can take questions. One or two questions. Questions? Yes, gentleman in the back. Yeah, it's in a short answer, it'll be hard to do, but we can certainly talk at the break. Depending on the technology you're talking about, some ledgers operate only in a permissioned enterprise context. In a public ledger scenario, you're talking about something like public version of Ethereum or public version of Bitcoin, and people are doing programming on top of those. The way you want to think about this, William mentioned this earlier, is sort of the intranet versus the internet. And if you think about your enterprise systems today, everything is secured behind a firewall and exists on your intranet in a permissioned environment. If you want to expose something to a third party, you would typically do it in a secure way on your website. If you wanted to move business logic outside of your network, you might expose some APIs outside of your network. You might think of that as the public blockchain part of business logic. Other question? I think somewhere in the front here. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear the question. Oh, okay. Got it. So step one, you're not going to take an existing database and change it into a blockchain. You will take an existing database and look at facets of that database that might be interesting from the perspective of a multi-party interaction, and then look at how you actually sort of step into that. The data, more than likely in a database, is a large amount of data, and it's probably going to stay there for quite some time. So you want to look at the interaction points and see how blockchain might actually create a value proposition in the interaction points. One more question? And then we're going to take a break, right? Okay. Oh, come on. You already asked a question. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, great question. In any industry, you have leaders, laggards, and aggressives and non-aggressives. If I guess is a better way to put it. And I would say the 5 to 10% case are the leaders today, and we're looking at those cases very carefully to shine light into those industries, whether it's automotive or different types of supply chain or what have you. What I would say is that what's happened over the last year is that people have gotten comfortable enough with the technology that they can say, okay, we get it, the technology has some interesting trust qualities and security context qualities, and the technology is evolving like every early, immature technology, but we know there's something there. And so if there's something there, then it has the potential to disrupt our business in the very near future, and therefore we should start studying it. So that's what we're seeing. I think we've gotten past the point of, this is complete craziness, right? There's an interesting technology. It's going to evolve because it's early, but very quickly we'll get to, the value proposition. So people often ask, when do we get there? I actually think because of the internet and e-commerce, we will be there a lot faster than people actually realize, and a lot faster than internet and e-commerce happened. So I'm sort of looking at, we'll see production use cases this year. There are already some out there. And we'll see that 5 to 10% getting there really quickly in the next 2 to 3 years, and we'll see continued evolution. But I look at the 5-year horizon as being really significant. So thank you very much.
How about another round of applause for all of our awesome speakers this morning? So Tyler asked me to be a bear with timing, so I'm going to give you all a 15-minute break. If you can be back here by 10:30, and we'll start back up with IBM. Thank you very much.